Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of Fighting Chance by Toni Denise, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me for chapter 1. The conference room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop as everyone went around the table talking about their stories they were working on. It was an intense meeting each week as everyone pitched their ideas and waited for their boss to approve them or tear them a new one. This week, she already knew she was in trouble. The story she had was lame, but it was the only thing she'd come up with. Why in the world had anyone thought she could be a good fit as a sports reporter? Robert, her boss, called on her. Kendall? I'm following the trade deal on the Badgers. Their local soccer team was trading a few players. No one cares. Come up with something better before tomorrow, or you're fired. I've warned you too many times that you need hard-hitting articles, and I'm not going to do it again. Be in my office first thing in the morning with a better idea or a letter of resignation. You choose which, he bellowed. Robert didn't speak. He only yelled. It was terrifying at first, but then you got used to it. He'd fire her, though. She knew he was a lot of bluster sometimes, but this was serious. She had been told too many times. He moved on to the next person and approved their article before the meeting was dismissed. Everyone quickly left the conference room, a few sending her sympathetic looks as they did. She let herself be the last one out of the room, shutting her laptop and stacking her notebook on top before picking them up and heading for her small desk on the floor with everyone else. What are you going to do? Sydney, her friend and lifestyle reporter, asked as she reached her desk. I have no idea. If I had a better story idea, I would have led with that. She dropped her head into her hands as she sat. I'm screwed. You'll come up with something. She patted Kendall on the back before walking away. Gee, thanks, she muttered. Kendall drew herself up and took a fortifying breath before opening her computer. She did the same thing that she always did and scoured the internet for other sports articles, looking for anything that she might be able to use as an idea for something local. They didn't have many local teams, and their soccer team wasn't wildly popular, though maybe if more people read about them, they'd grow more interested. The local university was closed for the summer as far as sports went, so there was nothing there. So no one knew who went there. No one knew who went there wanted to talk to her anyway. No one who went there wanted to talk to her anyway. That was her other issue. So many men who didn't want to talk to a female sports reporter. It wasn't like she was clueless, but they all assumed she was. And she'd been told more than once not to worry her pretty little head over the men things. That always pissed her off. Her phone rang and she answered without looking at who it was, welcoming the distraction. Hey, kiddo. Hey, Dad, what's up? How's work? He knew she'd been struggling. Not so great. Well, let me take you to lunch and see what I can do to help, he offered. I don't think there's much you can do to help, but I'll let you buy me lunch because I'm about to lose my job and won't have any money for food soon. She was whining and she knew it. Don't talk like that. You know it will go better than you expect. I'll see you at the pub at noon. Thanks, Dad. She ended the call and went back to her research. Maybe she should change her tactic and search small newspapers to see what they did instead of the big papers. By the time she was due to leave for lunch, she had gotten nowhere. The smaller newspaper were all doing the same types of stories that she was already doing, which wasn't enough. Kendall slid her laptop and notebook into her bag before taking a moment to let down her curly blonde hair from the bun she'd shoved it into earlier. She didn't want to look a mess when she met with her dad, even if her whole career was one. The pub was a 10-minute walk from her office, so she left her car there and headed out on foot. She'd likely go home after lunch, but the walk would be good for counteracting all the fries which she was about to eat. Hoping the walk would also clear her head, she set out for the pub. Danny's always had good food, and if she couldn't get anything else right today, she could at least eat well. Kendall, her dad yelled from across the pub as she entered. She smiled and waved and used to his loud nature. He'd been the loudest person she'd known her whole life. There was no point in being embarrassed by it anymore, since everyone in here knew him by name and that he was loud. Hey, Dad, she said as she slid into the booth. The pub was like a second home to her, and she smiled as she looked around. She waved at the people she knew as she took in the dark wood everywhere and all the sports photos and autographs on the wall. It was an eclectic mix of all things sports. If there was a competition of any kind, they'd broadcast it in here, bet on it, and get autographs from everyone involved, winners and losers both. I already put our order in. He slid her soda across to her. What's going on with your job? She let her shoulders slump. I can't do anything right. Nothing I write about is good enough. Your writing is damn good, he defended her, ending his declaration with a thump on the table from his fist to drive his point home. The problem isn't my writing skills, it's my topics. They aren't hard hitting enough for my boss, and unless I can come up with something better by tomorrow, then I'm out. It hurt to even say out loud. Nonsense. We're fighters, you and I. You'll come up with something, he assured her. Rich, her dad, had been a fighter, not her. He believed that because he was one of the best boxers during his time, that his talent passed on to her. It hadn't, sadly. She was in the corner here with no fancy moves to get out. I read your last article. It's good work, Grady, the owner, told her as he carried their food to the table. Thanks, she mumbled, not wanting to even explain why he'd probably never read another one. Thanks, Grady. I'll catch up with you in a few. You got it, Rich. Let me know if you need anything. Her dad waited until Grady was out of earshot before he spoke again. What if I could give you a story? Like what? She asked as she shoved fries into her mouth. First, you'd have to promise not to be mad. The serious look on his face told her that she was definitely going to be mad. Explain. She slid her plate away and listened. I've been coaching this fighter. He's really good. You're supposed to be retired, taking it easy, considering moving to Florida. They'd been over it so many times. She knew he'd been up to something, but she didn't think he'd been coaching. Instantly on the defense, he held his hands up. I'm not in the ring, he assured her. That's not even the part you won't like. Kendall arched a brow at him and waited for him to continue. Why couldn't even lunch go right today? There's an underground MMA ring and there's a fight tonight. How underground? She'd write about it, but she didn't want to do anything that her dad would get in trouble for. It's not illegal. It's just not well known, he said cautiously. So if I wrote about it, would anyone get in trouble? She was a terrible reporter. This was exactly the type of thing she needed to do to keep her job. No, some might be less than thrilled about the attention, but no one would get in trouble with the law. Using both hands, he picked up his burger. Just come tonight and then you can decide. Taking a massive bite, he smiled at her, clearly done talking about it. I'll think about it. She pulled her plate back to her and picked up her own burger. Her dad sat there grinning at her, knowing she'd come tonight, even as she debated it. Hell, she knew she'd be there, even if there was no story. She didn't know anything about MMA other than the fact that she'd watched a match or two with her father before. Watched was a loose definition. She played on her phone as he watched it, and she cheered when he did. Fine, but I don't know about the story part. I'll come and support you, though, she told him and took a bite of her burger. That's all I ask, he replied. His grin didn't fade a bit. She'd have to go home and do some research before the match, so she could at least look like she knew what she was doing there. Not that she had time for that. Chapter 2. Chad sat in the locker room doing his deep breathing to calm his mind before his fight tonight. This was only his second fight with Rich as his coach, but he'd felt better prepared than he ever had before. He'd already warmed up with Rich before, and now he was trying to harness all of his energy for the fight. His muscles were warmed and ready, and his mind was getting there too. The trainer sat across from him, wrapping his hands before he put his gloves on. The tape would provide a little more protection beneath the gloves for his knuckles, which were going to take a beating, or rather give one, if he remained focused. Once his hands were taped, he was ready to walk out whenever they called him, but he still had a good half hour. Rich had taught him that being prepared early helped you stay focused, and so far he agreed with the man. He'd met Rich in the gym, and only after an hour with him, Chad had begged Rich to train him. Rich was older, and he was a boxer, not a mixed martial arts fighter, but the control Chad was learning from him was more valuable than any other coaches had taught him. Fighting had been the one thing he'd been doing his whole life with little success. He'd always gotten good grades, but he couldn't take on the largest guy after school and win. He'd never dreamed of even making it this far, but if he did well here, he knew he had a shot at taking it to the real deal fights like UFC. One day he'd made it far. One day he might make it that far. It had been his dream for longer than he could remember. It would also really stick it to all those people that said fighting wouldn't get him anywhere. Growing up as a nerd, he was always bullied, and fighting had been something he'd wanted to learn. As an adult, his image had changed thanks to the people he paid to help him with that transition. But this, fighting and winning, was the last thing he needed to complete his image change. He'd gotten tattoos too, much to the concern of the image consultant, but they didn't show when he was wearing a suit and tie. He'd gotten those tattoos for himself as he'd bulked up from training, needing to see himself differently in and out of clothes. The image, the tattoos, the fighting, it all reflected his transition from the nerdy kid he'd been to the respected adult that women wanted and men wanted to be. No one would see the tattoos except the women, but he knew they were there and how intimidating having them made him feel and look underneath his suit. How are you feeling? Rich asked as he entered the locker room. I'm feeling good about this one, Chad told him, holding his taped hands out for inspection. Good, good. Rich checked over his tape and helped him slide his gloves on. Dad? A woman's voice said from the locker room door. We're decent. You can come in, Rich answered. A blonde woman walked in wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, her smile nearly knocking him out of his seat. She was beautiful, and now he was distracted. Shit. I just wanted to let you know I was here and wish you luck. She kissed Rich on the cheek. Chad, this is my daughter, Kendall. Kendall, meet Chad. So, you're the guy that got my dad to come out of retirement when he's supposed to be relaxing. Her hands came to her hips, and he felt like a kid in school being scolded by the teacher. Calm it down. He needs a clear head. You can yell at him later, Rich told her. Visions of her angry and yelling at him danced across his mind. Then came visions of making up after she was done being mad. He shook his head. This was exactly what he didn't need. Not to mention that, as she was Rich's daughter, there was no one more off limits. Now wasn't the time in his life for the complications that women brought. He knew better. He had a few women he could call for a good night, and he needed nothing beyond that. Or so he told himself. Fine, she said in a glare, before turning her attention back to Rich. There's a lot of people out there for something that isn't that well known, she arched her brow at Rich. Glad to see we have a good turnout. You're going to be able to get a seat? She rolled her eyes. I'm sure I can squeeze in somewhere. Well, you best get off and do that before there's nowhere left for you, Rich told her. Kendall's jaw fell for a second before she recovered. Did you just dismiss me? She pressed a hand to her chest in shock, her smile showing it was all a joke. Rich shrugged. Gotta get Chad ready for the fight. Fine, guess I'll go make sure I can find a seat now. Sit higher up so you can see the whole fight, Rich advised as he hugged her. You act like I'm new at this, she laughed as she turned to the door. Good luck, Chad, she added to him before she left. I didn't know you had a daughter, Rich, Chad pointed out. I don't mix family with fighting often, which made Chad wonder why he was doing that now. Rich was a private man, always had been, even at his peak as a boxer. He frustrated reports by remaining largely quiet on anything personal. Back to the breathing, Rich reminded him. Right. Chad sat up tall and tried to focus. He pushed everything from his mind, including the fight, and focused on his breaths. Meditation wasn't something he would have ever bought into, but Rich had convinced him. The best part was that it worked. Setting his mind free of all his worries right before any fight, even a practice one, had helped him immensely. He went into fights focused, ready, and won more often than not. His punches had improved, as had his accuracy since starting with Rich. Next week, he had a training session with someone Rich needed to work with on his takedowns, something that Rich wasn't able to help him with. Chad knew he'd come a long way in just a few months. He listened to everything Rich told him, which was different than he'd done with any other coach. Focus, Rich reminded him, knowing his thoughts were wandering. He pushed the thoughts away for later and went back to focusing on his breath, in through the nose and out through the mouth. Someone knocked on the door and said, "They're ready for you." Tell them we're coming, Rich called back before looking at Chad. Remember, tonight isn't about winning. It's about your skill level. Get out there and focus on what you're doing. It was the same advice he'd given before the last fight. Chad nodded. He was still working on that focus, but damned if he wasn't trying. Chad stood up and let Rich lead him out of the locker room and down the hall to the octagon. Kendall hadn't been exaggerating. The place was packed, more so than he'd ever seen. Don't look at anyone. Just keep your mind on your breathing and your goal, Rich reminded him. He was grateful for the reminder because he found he wanted to look for Kendall, but kept his gaze neutral instead. He didn't make eye contact with anyone as he entered the ring and waved his arms to pump up the crowd. The crowd played into his request and got louder from every angle. His opponent was already in the octagon, which meant the fight was soon to start. The cage was closed, leaving just him and the other man he'd be fighting, and the ref inside. He took stock of his opponent. The man was from out of town, and although Chad had watched a few recordings of his fight, it was different seeing the man in person. His opponent seemed evenly matched in size. Chad's fighting skills were better based on what he had seen in the videos, though. He hoped they were. 3 rounds were exhausting for both fighters, but if one had the upper hand from the start, it used considerably less energy. Men, touch gloves and wait for my signal. Chad moved forward, his gloves quickly making contact with the other fighters before he backed away. The referee stood between them with his arm up. His arm came down, cutting the tension between them like a knife. Fight.